3 properties, 3 generations, 30 years of tragedy. Power is often said to be built on money, but for one family, power was built on something else. Addresses. A compound on Cape Cod, a winter estate in Palm Beach, and a chaotic manor outside Washington. These houses created the image of the Kennedy dynasty. They appeared on magazine covers. They were presented as symbols of the American dream. But these houses also witnessed something else. Deaths that repeated, bedrooms that slowly fell silent, tragedies arriving with a frequency that made people begin to whisper. They called it a curse. If power is built through property, what happens when those properties become witnesses to collapse? Hyannisport, Palm Beach, Hickory Hill. 3 places, 3 phases of power, 3 silent courtrooms of history. In this film, we will walk through each one, not to accuse, not to defend, but to observe. To observe how power is manufactured, how image is controlled, and how the cost is recorded quietly inside the walls. This is not just a story about a famous family. It is a story about America, about how myths are constructed and what is left behind to keep those myths standing. But to understand how it all ended this way, we have to return to a moment before anyone called it a curse. The year was 1928, when one man stood on the edge of Cape Cod and believed he could build a dynasty from a single piece of land. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. For more stories about legacy, power, and the hidden cost behind legendary estates, 1928. The rumored bootlegger builds his kingdom. The year was 1928. In America, power was still believed to belong to names that had existed long enough. Families rooted deep in history, Protestant lineages that did not need to explain who they were. Joseph Patrick Kennedy did not belong to that world. He was Irish Catholic, born into an immigrant community in Boston, a group widely regarded as second class within the social hierarchy of early 20th century America. His father, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, was not a gentleman of old money. He was a saloon owner, but not merely a man who sold alcohol. Patrick Kennedy was a ward boss, a political power broker within Boston's urban machine politics. He controlled votes. He controlled access to jobs. He decided who received help and who did not. In return, he wielded a kind of power that rarely appeared in newspapers, but often determined local election outcomes. Joseph Kennedy grew up inside that system, and he learned something early. Power did not come from ideals. It came from understanding how the system actually worked. By the late 1922, Joseph Kennedy was a millionaire at the age of 40. His wealth came from multiple sources: stock market speculation, using techniques that were legal at the time, but later considered market manipulation. Investments in Hollywood, where he controlled film studios and distribution networks. And then there were the whispers, rumors that followed him for decades. That part of his fortune came from bootlegging, illegal alcohol trade during Prohibition. There was never a legal ruling that proved it. Joseph Kennedy always denied the allegation. But in elite society, what matters is not only what is true, but what people are willing to believe. And for Joseph Kennedy, money alone was not enough. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted status. He wanted his children to enter rooms that money by itself could not open. In America, an address was a signal of power. Cape Cod was not just a stretch of coastline. It was where old money spent its summers. Old money summering. Since the late 19th century, wealthy New England families returned to Cape Cod year after year. The Lodge family, which produced senators and diplomats. The Saltonstall family, a political dynasty tied to Massachusetts for generations. They did not come merely to vacation. They came to maintain presence. The same place, the same season, repeated long enough to turn geography into territory. Cape Cod did not require castles. It required repetition. Joseph Kennedy understood this perfectly. In 1928, he purchased land in Hyannisport, 6 acres of waterfront property. Not one house, but 3. One main residence, 2 smaller houses within the same compound. By today's standards, a waterfront estate of this scale in Cape Cod would be worth tens of millions of dollars. But the real value was not the price. It was the message. Hyannis Port was close enough to Boston to remain connected to power, far enough to feel insulated, and positioned precisely to signal entry into elite space. Even the architecture was deliberate. Classic New England design, white clapboard, green shutters, porches facing the water. No extravagance, no castles, no monuments. Among America's upper class, true wealth did not announce itself. It whispered. Joseph Kennedy did not buy a house to live in. He bought a system. 3 houses served a purpose: to keep his children close, to ensure that even after marriage, his sons would remain inside the compound. No dispersal, no fragmentation, no loss of control. One family, one center, one direction. Rose Kennedy, his wife, ran the system. She was the daughter of Boston's mayor, raised in politics, fully aware of the value of image. She managed the family like an organization. 9 children, strict schedules, clear discipline. The house became a training ground. On the lawn, touch football was not recreation. It was competition. At the dock, sailing races were constant, not for pleasure, but to see who quit first. At the dinner table, meals were debates, current events, politics, economics. If you had not read the newspaper and cost you, as you would be overrun. There was an unspoken rule. Kennedys do not lose. Rose added another layer of discipline. Catholicism. Regular church attendance. Daily prayers. Strict standards of behavior and appearance. This family did not only have to be strong, they had to look right. Neighbors in Hyannis Port were not pleased. An Irish Catholic family, loud and competitive, suddenly occupying a summer enclave of WASP society. Children everywhere. Laughter. Arguments. New money. Outsiders. Wrong tone. But Joseph Kennedy did not need acceptance. He had purchased position, and he intended to stay. Standing on the porch, watching his children play football, Joseph Kennedy did not see a summer vacation. He saw future senators, a potential president, a dynasty being trained from childhood. But from the very beginning, at this exact place, a silent question emerged. When childhood becomes a training campaign, are you paying a price before you even know what it is? And this is where the story begins to turn. 3 houses, 9 children, 1 dream. At Hyannis Port, a family began to function like a structure of power. 9 children grew up at the same address, but not in the same position. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., born in 1915, was the eldest son. From the beginning, he was seen as the natural heir. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, born in 1917, came 2 years later. Smaller in build, frequently ill, often absent from the games on the lawn. Rosemary Kennedy, born in 1918, was the first daughter. At first, she blended in normally, but over time, her learning pace fell behind her siblings. Kathleen Kennedy, born in 1920, known as Kick, was outgoing, socially gifted, comfortable in almost any environment. Eunice Kennedy, born in 1921, was more serious, quieter, more inclined to observe than to compete. Patricia Kennedy, born in 1924, was gentle, less visible in direct rivalry. Robert Francis Kennedy, born in 1925, was reserved, emotionally perceptive, not physically dominant, but acutely aware of the dynamics around him. Jean Kennedy, born in 1928, the same year the family purchased the Hyannis Port compound, grew up entirely within this atmosphere. Edward Ted Kennedy, born in 1932, was the youngest. By the time he arrived, The rules of the system were already set. The dinner table was where that structure became most visible. Children were expected to follow current events, to read the newspaper, to answer questions, to argue. Silence was not humility. Silence was failure. During these meals, Joseph Kennedy Sr. observed more than he instructed, who reacted quickly, who could handle pressure, who dared to push back. Joe Jr. fit the role perfectly. John did not. He often entered debates too late, left the table early, exhausted. No one called John a failure, but no one placed him at the center either. He existed as a backup in a family that never spoke the word aloud. With Rosemary, the difference became harder to ignore. There was no clear medical diagnosis at the time. Early 20th century medicine lacked the tools to define developmental differences with precision. The family did not call it an illness. They called it something to be corrected. Tutors were hired. Tutors were hired. Tutors were hired. Tutors were hired. Lessons were adjusted. Discipline was tightened. But in a household where speed was the standard, slowness became a liability. Rosemary did not lose a competition. She lost in a system that had no tolerance for a different pace. Tension formed quietly, not through open conflict, but through stratification. Who was asked for opinions? Who had decisions made for them? Who was prepared for public futures? Who was held back? Hyannisport was not just a place where children grew up, it was where roles were assigned early. And when a family begins to treat weakness as unacceptable, the question is no longer who will succeed, it becomes who will be pushed out of the story first. It was in this environment that Joseph Kennedy Sr. began to think about the next move. Hyannisport was sufficient for training, but not for operating power year-round. A dynasty could not exist seasonally. This family needed a winter headquarters. And that was the moment the story began to turn. Because when a family treats weakness as a crime, the first person removed from the orbit is rarely the last. 1933, the Winter Palace. The year was 1933. America was at the bottom of the Great Depression. More than a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Banks were collapsing. Families who had once been wealthy were selling assets simply to survive. But Joseph Kennedy was not. He had exited the stock market before the crash of 1929. Not by luck, but by reading the psychology of the crowd. While much of America was selling in desperation, Joe Kennedy was buying. And he looked south. Palm Beach, Florida. Before the Depression, Palm Beach had been the winter playground of America's ultra-wealthy. Mediterranean-style estates lined North Ocean Boulevard, facing the Atlantic, where industrial dynasties escaped northern winters. The economic collapse turned that paradise into a liquidation market. In 1933, according to Forbes, Joseph Kennedy purchased an estate known as La Garita at a price far below its pre-crash value. The architecture was Mediterranean revival. Red tile roofs, arched doorways, an enclosed courtyard, ocean-front exposure, not ostentatious like a palace, but deliberate. If Hyannisport was a training ground, Palm Beach was a negotiation room. Here, Joe Kennedy did not need to prove where he belonged. High walls and tropical landscaping created a level of privacy Cape Cod could not offer. No neighbors watching, no WASP community measuring every move. Palm Beach gave Joe what he needed at this stage. A place where power could operate quietly. The Kennedy family began living by seasonal rhythm. Summers in Hyannisport, winters in Palm Beach. 2 addresses, 2 functions. In Cape Cod, the children were trained. In Palm Beach, they were introduced. Formal dinners, private meetings, handshakes that never appeared in newspapers. Joe Kennedy was not simply raising a family. He was building a network. But Palm Beach also exposed fractures. Its refined social environment revealed differences that Hyannisport could still conceal. For Rosemary, those differences became impossible to ignore. Long conversations, rapid social exchanges, unspoken rules of elite society. There was no formal medical diagnosis at the time, but in this setting, difference was no longer a private matter. It became a reputational risk. Then, another form of power arrived. In 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Joseph Kennedy as United States Ambassador to the United Kingdom. An Irish Catholic, standing at the court of St. Thomas, the diplomatic heart of the British Empire. This was the peak of Joe Kennedy's authority. The family moved between America and Europe. Palm Beach and Hyannisport became two parallel power centers. But the appointment did not last. Joe Kennedy's views on the European war proved deeply controversial. By 1940, he resigned under political isolation. The family returned to the United States. The houses remained. The infrastructure of power remained. But the atmosphere had changed. Europe was burning. War was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. And war does not care how cheaply you bought your house, because you can purchase property when others are desperate, but you cannot purchase what arrives with war. Rosemary, the daughter who disappeared. There was one thing missing from the family photographs. As the Kennedy dynasty moved closer to the public stage, one name slowly faded from the frame. Not suddenly, not through any announcement, but through deliberate silence. Rosemary. By the late 1930s, differences that could once be contained within the family no longer remained private. Dinners grew longer. Social gatherings became more political. Expectations tightened, and every deviation was magnified. Joseph Kennedy, now approaching the center of national power, no longer viewed the situation solely as a father. He saw it as a structural risk. According to historical records, he feared Rosemary could be taken advantage of. He feared unpredictable behavior might become a public liability for a family preparing to enter the highest levels of politics. This was no longer about education. It became about control. And this is where the story turns. In 1941, a new medical procedure was being promoted in the United States as a solution to behavioral issues. Lobotomy. According to NPS.gov, it was an experimental practice not widely accepted by the medical community and associated with severe risks. Some physicians believed it could reduce impulses, making patients more manageable, but the long-term consequences were not yet fully understood. In November 1941, Rosemary Kennedy underwent the procedure. The decision was made within a narrow circle. There was no open discussion, no informed consent as we understand it today. The outcome was immediate and devastating. Rosemary lost the ability to live independently. Her capacity for communication declined sharply. She required full-time care. Shortly afterward, she was removed from family life. There was no public explanation, no announcement, only an absence within a system that had once been tightly controlled. Rosemary was placed in care facilities, eventually at St. Coletta School in Wisconsin. The family spoke little of her. Visits were rare. The official story remained vague. The truth stayed hidden until the 1,960 seconds when global media attention exposed the private costs of the Kennedy legacy. Today, Rosemary's case is often cited as a tragic example of an era of experimental medicine when the boundary between treatment and control had not yet been clearly defined. This was not a simple conspiracy, nor an isolated accident. It was the result of political pressure, fear of image, and misplaced trust in a science not yet prepared to account for its consequences. And when Rosemary disappeared from the story, a precedent was set that in this dynasty, difference could not exist in public view. If a dynasty demands perfection, what does it do with a child who does not fit the mold? 1944. War comes home. War had once been seen as a necessary test. For many American political families, World War II was not only a duty, but an opportunity to turn private names into public credibility. The Kennedy family saw the war that way too. After Joseph Kennedy withdrew from national politics in 1940, the axis of ambition shifted to the next generation. And despite his fragile health in youth, John Fitzgerald Kennedy entered the military. Not as a symbol, but as a young officer who needed to prove he was more than a backup plan. John was assigned to the PT Boat Force, small, fast patrol vessels, operating in some of the most dangerous conditions in the Pacific. This was not a safe posting. This was the front line. And it was there that the old assumptions about John Kennedy were tested. In August 1943, in the waters of the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, during a nighttime patrol mission, the patrol boat PT-109, commanded by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was moving slowly through dark waters. Out of the darkness, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, many times larger, suddenly appeared. There was no time to evade. Amagiri struck PT-109 head-on, cutting the small vessel in two. 2 crewmen were killed instantly. The others were thrown into the sea. In the darkness, amid oil slicks and debris, John Kennedy did not abandon command. According to records from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, he organized the survivors, swam for hours through strong currents, and towed a badly injured crewman by gripping the strap of a life jacket with his teeth. After several days adrift, they were rescued. The incident quickly moved beyond the military. American newspapers called it heroism. Kennedy's image appeared nationwide. Medals were awarded. That act did more than save lives. It created a public record, an image that could be managed, a story that could be told, a foundation for future political ambition. And this is where the story turns. Because in the Kennedy family, there was never room for only one hero. Joseph Kennedy Jr., born in 1915, the eldest son, the original chosen heir, was watching the balance shift. The younger brother, once seen as frail, was now being celebrated as a war hero. Joe Jr. could not remain still. In 1944, he volunteered for an extraordinarily dangerous mission, known as Operation Aphrodite. It was an experimental operation of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Obsolete bombers were packed with explosives. Pilots would take off, then parachute out, leaving the aircraft to be guided remotely toward German targets. The risks were extreme. The failure rate was high, but success would have meant a triumph beyond any shadow. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. aircraft exploded in midair before he could exit the cockpit. There was no parachute, no distress signal. According to Wikipedia and military records, the blast was so violent that no remains could be recovered. At Hyannisport, a telegram arrived. Thin paper, few words, no details. The Kennedy family learned that their eldest son was dead. The house that had once been a training ground became a place of mourning. Joe Jr.'s bedroom was left untouched. Sports trophies, family photographs, objects prepared for a future that would never arrive. The war did not take only one child. It reversed the entire order of succession, and it was not finished. Just 1 month later, in September 1944, another message arrived from Europe. Kathleen Kick Kennedy, who had married William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, a member of one of Britain's oldest aristocratic families. William was killed in action in Belgium. The marriage had lasted less than 4 months. A Kick became a widow at 24. She did not return to Hyannisport. She remained in England. Hyannisport, in the summer of 1944, was no longer a symbol of ambition. It became the place where telegrams were opened and empty chairs began to appear. War had once been considered a political launch pad until it sent back a sheet of paper, thinner than ambition itself. Kick's rebellion to the French Alps. After the summer of 1944, Hyannisport was no longer a place to return to. Empty chairs appeared more frequently, and for Kathleen Kick Kennedy, that rupture did not lead to silence. it led to departure. Kik had always been different within the family, outgoing, socially fluent, more at ease in the outside world than within the family's rigid orbit. As the war continued, Kik remained in London, working with the Red Cross. This was not a ceremonial role. London was under constant bombardment. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Civilians and soldiers were treated side by side. In that environment, Kik experienced life beyond the gravitational pull of her family. For the first time, and it was there, that older tension surfaced. The Kennedy family was devoutly Catholic. The British aristocratic circles Kik moved within were largely Protestant. This difference was not only theological, it shaped politics, marriage, public image. Kik understood that. In 1944, she married William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, a Protestant British aristocrat. The marriage itself caused controversy, but it remained within the bounds of what the family could tolerate until the war intervened again. Only months after the wedding, William Cavendish was killed in action in Belgium. Kik became a widow at 24. The family expected her to return to America, to return to Hyannis Port, to return to order. But Kik did not come home. She stayed in Europe. And this is where the story truly turns. After the war, Kik began a relationship with Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, Earl Fitzwilliam, a British aristocrat. Married, not divorced, for the Kennedy family. This was no longer cultural difference. It was scandal. A Catholic widow, in a relationship with a Protestant man, still legally married to another woman. Every layer of image the family had constructed was suddenly at risk. The response was swift. Joseph and Rose Kennedy strongly opposed the relationship. Correspondence grew cold. Distance formed without any formal declaration. Kik understood the consequences, but she did not retreat. According to historical accounts, some members of the family viewed the relationship through a lens of faith, not as a personal choice, but as a moral deviation. This interpretation was subjective, not a statement of fact, yet it profoundly shaped the family's response. And then tragedy arrived quickly. On May 13, 1948, Kik and Fitzwilliam boarded a small aircraft departing from France. The plane crashed in the French Alps under poor weather conditions. There were no survivors. Kathleen Kennedy was 28 years old. News reached the United States, but the family's response shocked observers. Joseph and Rose Kennedy did not attend the funeral. The reasons were never fully explained, and historical records offer competing interpretations. No definitive conclusion exists. Only silence. Hyannis Port gained another empty room. Unlike Rosemary, Kik did not disappear into secrecy. She vanished in public, in an accident, in controversy, yet the result was the same: a child who left the family's orbit and never returned. For the Kennedy family, leaving that orbit was not merely rebellion, it was seen as placing oneself in danger. The rise, JFK. After 1944, the compound at Hyannis Port was no longer a place of training. It became a space waiting to be filled. Joseph Kennedy Jr. was gone. The original heir no longer existed, and that position, unspoken but unavoidable, shifted toward John Fitzgerald Kennedy. John had not grown up with a clear political ambition. For years, he was seen as capable enough to keep pace, but not as the center of the family's long-term design. His brother's death changed that, not through a dramatic declaration, that's Death's will, but through a series of quiet rearrangements. The family needed someone to step forward, and John was the remaining figure who could. In 1946, John Kennedy ran for the United States House of Representatives. In Massachusetts, Hyannis Port became the rear base. Campaign operations were organized inside the compound. Summer gatherings turned into meetings with voters. The family network was fully activated. John won. It was the first step. 6 years later, in 1952, John Kennedy set his sights on the U.S. Senate. His opponent was Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., a towering name among New England elites. Old, lineage, WASP, heritage, a symbol of the established order. This contest meant more than a single Senate seat. It was a confrontation between a rising dynasty and a weakening tradition. John Kennedy won by a narrow margin. With that victory, the compound was no longer just a family gathering place. It became a true center of political power. In 1953, John Kennedy married Jacqueline Bouvier. Jackie came from a different world. Refined, independent, accustomed to privacy rather than constant proximity. Hyannisport was not built for that. Inside the compound, everything was shared. Everyone observed. Every gesture was remembered. Jackie did not integrate easily into this dense, tightly controlled family culture. Her silence was often misread, her distance easily interpreted as detachment. Meanwhile, John Kennedy began shaping a national image. In 1957, in the Place des Sommes, A Certain Fine, the book Profiles in Courage was published. It won the Pulitzer Prize, but it also sparked controversy. Many scholars have argued that much of the writing was done by Ted Sorensen, Kennedy's close advisor. No official conclusion ever stripped John Kennedy of authorship, but the debate never fully disappeared. Even so, the book achieved its central purpose. It transformed John Kennedy from a young politician into a moral symbol. That image was cultivated at the compound, protected, refined. By the late 1950 seconds, all signs pointed toward a larger campaign in preparation. Hyannisport functioned like a brain. Schedules, strategy, and media messaging were discussed in rooms that had once been family dining spaces. At the same time, the family expanded its strategic geography. In 1955, John and Jackie purchased Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia, a large estate close enough to Washington, D.C., to host political figures, yet distant enough to escape the compound's constant gaze. It was not a replacement. It was an addition. Hyannisport remained the heart. Hickory Hill became the arm, reaching into federal power. John Kennedy was closer than ever to the position the compound had been built to produce. But with that rise, Evan and Welve rise, a new pressure formed. Because the compound, when 70 tests, did not only forge a president, it also created a space where the woman who entered it could feel suffocated. And that was the cost. Jackie Kennedy was about to face Bobby's chaos, Hickory Hill. Within the Kennedy family, Robert Francis Kennedy always occupied a different position. Born in 1925, Bobby was the younger brother of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, less glamorous, less visible. But if John was the public face, Bobby was the engine behind the scenes. He did not cultivate image. He organized, enforced, and confronted. As the family's center of power shifted toward Washington, Bobby became indispensable. On October 15, 1955, John Fitzgerald Kennedy purchased Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia, a large estate close enough to Washington to operate within federal power, yet distant enough to avoid constant public scrutiny. Hickory Hill was intended to become a new strategic base outside Hyannisport, but it was never Jacqueline Kennedy's space. For Jackie, Hickory Hill felt too close to politics, too exposed, too far from the refined social world. She understood. The size of the house did not bring security. It brought the machinery of power deeper into private life. After only a short time, John and Jackie chose not to stay. In 1957, Hickory Hill was sold to Robert Francis Kennedy, and his family moved in. According to Virginia Living, from that moment on, the house entered an entirely different phase. If Hyannisport functioned through discipline, 100 Bon ATN's Hickory Hill functioned through energy. Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's wife, transformed the estate into a crowded, noisy household. Children filled every corner. Animals roamed the grounds. Laughter replaced formality. Bobby and Ethel had 11 children, a number that reflected not just size, but a philosophy of life. Hickory Hill had no rigid boundaries. Friends, aides, and politicians came and went without fixed schedules. A famous tradition emerged. Anyone who visited, whether senator or journalist, might find themselves thrown into the swimming pool. It was a way of breaking hierarchy and a way of controlling the atmosphere. But warmth did not mean weakness. When John F. Kennedy became president, Bobby was appointed Attorney General of the United States. One of the most powerful legal positions in the country was exercised from a house full of children and chaos. At Hickory Hill, the line between family and government nearly disappeared. Major decisions were discussed in the living room, over dinner, with children running through the halls. Critical phone calls rang out alongside everyday family life. If Hyannisport was a symbolic center of power, Hickory Hill was the operational core. Less ritual, more friction, more risk. The two spaces did not replace each other. They existed in parallel. One represented legacy and image. The other represented action and confrontation. That contrast created a dangerous illusion, and that pressure could be escaped by changing location. That warmth could soften power. But history rarely offered the Kennedy family an exit. When one branch of power shifted from discipline to warmth, it appeared to be a solution. But for the Kennedys, it was simply another form of the same pressure. The summer White House, Camelot, in 1961. John Fitzgerald Kennedy took the oath of office as President of the United States. From that moment on, no questions, Hyannisport was no longer just a family summer retreat. It became the summer White House. Roads leading into the compound were secured by the Secret Service. The press gathered at the gates. A helicopter landing pad was installed on the lawn. The machinery of the nation now passed through a place that had once been a children's playground. Each summer, the president and his family returned to Hyannisport, but privacy was gone. Sailing trips, family meals, moments that once felt ordinary were now public images. The Kennedy family was seen as an American royal household, a young president, an elegant first lady, children appearing before the cameras as symbols of the future. The press called it Camelot, a legend built not only on politics, but on imagery. Yet behind that stage, the structure of power within the family was shifting. On December 19, 1961, in Palm Beach, Joseph Kennedy Sr. suffered a severe stroke. According to records from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, he lost the ability to speak and withdrew almost completely from public life. The man who had once been House's Cypriotian and since 40, the axis of the family's power, could no longer command. That silence was not only medical, it was a vacuum, and the vacuum was filled quickly. Robert Francis Kennedy became the president's closest advisor, no longer operating in the background, no longer a secondary branch of power. Bobby moved to the center. Critical decisions no longer passed through the father. They were discussed directly between two brothers. Hyannisport, Hickory Hill, and the White House began to function as a single system. At the same time, the pressure on Jacqueline Kennedy intensified. Camelot was a beautiful image, but it had no exit. Jackie was relentlessly photographed. Every movement tracked, every dress analyzed. Even at Hyannisport, once a private family space, there was no refuge. The compound's walls could not stop the cameras. The suffocation did not come from a single incident. It came from the disappearance of any backstage. The Kennedy family had reached the peak of power. But the price of that peak was the collapse of the boundary between home and nation. And that is always the signal, because the highest point of power rarely announces itself quietly. For the Kennedys, the signal was the moment when a house stopped being a home and became a national stage. November 22, 1963, the compound goes dark. On the morning of November 22, 1963, in Hyannisport, Rose Kennedy was at church. She attended morning mass, as she had for decades. It was routine. It was structure. At the same moment, in Dallas, Texas, the presidential motorcade moved through Dealey Plaza. The first news did not arrive as grief. It arrived as a broadcast interruption. Shots fired in Dallas. Then confusion. Then silence. Then confirmation. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was dead. The news reached Hyannisport faster than any plane. There was no ceremony, no preparation. The family began returning to the compound, by instinct. The same instinct, shaped by earlier losses. This was where they went, when there was nowhere else to go. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was inside the house. After his stroke in 1961, he could no longer speak. He understood everything, but he could not respond. On the television screen, the images from Dallas repeated. The open car, the panicked crowd, Jacqueline Kennedy in a pink suit stained with blood. Joe Sr. watched it all, without words. There were no orders, no strategy, no correction, only helplessness. Jacqueline Kennedy returned to Hyannisport a few days later with Caroline and John Jr. The house that had been the summer White House could no longer hold her. Every room carried memory. Every step echoed presence. She stayed briefly. Then she left. Not because she did not love the place, but because she could not breathe inside it. In the weeks that followed, the compound changed its shape. The helipad was removed. Communications equipment was dismantled. Rooms that once served the nation and the Kunsthaus of Relasses fell silent. But this was not peace. It was absence. Flags hung at half-staff. The gates remained closed. Children's laughter no longer crossed the lawn. Hyannisport was no longer a center of power. It became a site of mourning. A place once designed to manufacture success, now preserved loss. The Kennedy family continued to gather there, but not to plan the future, only to endure the present. And it was here that a realization settled. A place that once proved the American dream could be constructed had become proof that the American dream could also be cut short. 1968, 2 more deaths. After 1963, the Kennedy family no longer spoke about power in the old way. But history did not allow them to stop. By 1968, it's Franum Minija, when the United States was in deep crisis. The Vietnam War divided society. Protests erupted across major cities. Public trust in government collapsed. In that atmosphere, and friends, many turned to a familiar name: Robert Francis Kennedy. Bobby did not want to run for president, not because he lacked ambition, but because he had seen the price of power. His brother had been assassinated. His family had fractured. The pressure came from outside. Supporters believed that if anyone could heal the country, it was Bobby. Eventually, he agreed. The campaign was organized. From Hickory Hill, the Virginia home that had once been a family refuge, now again a political center. Meetings took place in living rooms. Phones rang over the sound of children. Family and politics merged once more. On the night of June 5, 1968, in Los Angeles, after a victory speech, Robert Kennedy left the ballroom. Through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, a narrow corridor, dim lighting, no stage. Gunshots rang out. Robert Kennedy collapsed. He was shot at close range. Witnesses rushed forward. Chaos filled the room. He was rushed to the hospital. Doctors operated for hours. But in the early hours of June 6, 1000, 968, Robert Francis Kennedy died. He was 42 years old. Hickory Hill, once filled with laughter, became a house of mourning. 10 children lost their father. Another would be born, never knowing him. At Hyannis Port, Joseph Kennedy Sr. watched the news. On television, he could not speak, but his reaction was unmistakable. After Bobby's death, his health declined rapidly. The man who had built the entire structure of power was now a helpless witness to its collapse. On November 18, 1969, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. died at Hyannis Port. According to records from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, a father who lost 3 sons. The architect of a dynasty, no longer able to watch it continue. With his death, a circle closed. No commander remained. No center of decision. Only places that had witnessed too much tragedy. And from that point forward, a realization began to settle. When power is passed down, as an obligation, tragedy can also be passed down as a habit of history. Chappaquiddick, the last brother's shame. After 1969, only one brother remained in the direct line of succession. Edward Moore Kennedy, Ted. He did not carry John's halo. He did not project Bobby's moral intensity, but in the public mind, Ted was still the last viable continuation of the dynasty. And because of that, what happened that summer closed the final door. On the night of July 18, into the early hours of July 19, 1969, on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy left a small gathering for former members of Robert Kennedy's campaign. In the car with him was Mary Jo Kopechne, a young woman who had worked for Bobby. On a narrow road, the car took a wrong turn. It drove off and plunged into Poucha Pond. Ted Kennedy escaped the vehicle. Mary Jo Kopechne did not. She died inside the submerged car. What shocked the country was not only the crash, but what followed. Ted Kennedy did not report the accident during the night. It was not until after 10 a.m. the following morning that he contacted the police. That gap in time became the center of public scrutiny. Questions multiplied, not about driving mechanics, but about responsibility. Investigations followed. Legal proceedings concluded without severe criminal penalties. But the verdict of the public was different. For America, this was no longer a private tragedy. It was a scandal. The Kennedy family returned to the front pages, but no longer as Camelot. The compound at Hyannis Port was once again surrounded by reporters. Gates closed. Lawns fell silent. Ted Kennedy continued his political career. He remained a United States Senator for decades. But one thing changed permanently. In the public imagination, his path to the White House died at Poucha Pond. That night, not because of the law, but because of trust. For the American public, this was no longer a story of curses or destiny. It became a story of privilege and responsibility. And that is something, its crest, no dynasty can purchase. With real estate, 3 properties, 3 addresses once built to generate power: Hyannis Port, Palm Beach, Hickory Hill. They began as symbols of ambition, of discipline, of a dream engineered down to its smallest detail. But over time, those houses became more than places to live. They became witnesses. Witnesses to victory. Witnesses to loss. Witnesses to decisions made when power entered family life. The story of the so-called Kennedy curse does not need to be read as superstition. It can be reframed as a historical question. What happens when power is passed down as an obligation, when image becomes a way of living, and when private space is transformed into a tool of ambition? Those 3 properties once stood as symbols of an American dream that could be manufactured. But in the end, they also became monuments to memory, and to the price that was paid. Perhaps what remains is not a verdict of right or wrong, but a question. If that history leaves behind. If a family uses addresses to create power, can those same addresses become what traps that power inside memory and a sense of guilt? If you want to go deeper, the next stories will take you further into the relationship between power, private space, and the decisions that changed history. Watch the videos now appearing on your screen to continue that journey. And if this topic made you think, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment, sharing how you see this legacy. Thank you for watching.